Legendary doesn't begin to describe the woman whose voice could cut through a room like flint on stone, yet tremble when no one was listening, because behind Katharine Hepburn's iron spine lived a private world of longing, defiance, and love that almost destroyed her. She was raised to believe that emotion was something you mastered, not something you surrendered to. In the Hepburn household, strength was expected, silence was rewarded, and vulnerability was a language rarely spoken. Katharine learned early how to stand tall, how to keep her chin high even when the ground beneath her shifted. But what the world never saw was how often she went to bed with her heart racing, replaying conversations she never finished, letters she never sent, and goodbyes she never dared to say out loud. Fame wrapped itself around her like armor, but it also locked her into a life where intimacy came at a dangerous price. In the early years, Hollywood mistook her independence for arrogance. Studio executives whispered that she was difficult, that she refused to be owned. What they didn't understand was that Katharine had already seen what ownership could do to a soul. She had watched her family fracture under expectations, had felt the quiet pressure to be extraordinary at any cost. When she married young, it was less about romance and more about trying to fit into a shape the world told her was necessary. That marriage didn't break loudly. It faded slowly and painfully, like a photograph left too long in the sun. She rarely spoke of it, but the silence carried shame, and a fear that maybe she simply wasn't built for ordinary love. Then came the relationships that were never meant to be ordinary. Men who were powerful, brilliant, damaged. Men who recognized in her the same restless hunger they carried themselves. There were nights when she felt seen in ways that terrified her, moments when she almost believed she could lay down her armor and be held without losing herself. But Hollywood doesn't allow secrets to stay buried, and Katharine learned how quickly affection could turn into leverage, how easily love could be turned into gossip, scandal, or currency. One relationship in particular haunted her long after the cameras stopped rolling. It began quietly, almost professionally, and then deepened into something neither of them could control. He was married. He was sick in ways the public wasn't allowed to see. With him, Katharine found something she never expected to want: devotion without possession. But that devotion came with rules. Doors that stayed closed, public silences that cut deeper than arguments. She would later admit, in rare, unguarded moments, that loving him meant agreeing to live in the shadows of his life, accepting that she would never be chosen publicly, only privately. As the years passed, illness crept in. Not just his, but her own exhaustion. She became the caretaker no one knew about, sitting at bedsides after premieres, holding hands when pain made conversation impossible. There were nights she broke down alone in dressing rooms, her makeup streaked with tears she refused to explain. She memorized his breathing patterns, the sound of his cough, the way fear entered his eyes when he thought no one was watching. And when the end came, it didn't arrive with closure. It arrived with unfinished sentences, last words spoken too softly, and a grief she was forced to hide while the world applauded her strength. After his death, Katharine changed. Friends noticed it before audiences did. She laughed less freely. She worked harder than ever, as if motion could keep memory at bay. Other famous figures drifted in and out of her life. Actors, directors, admirers who tried to reach her, but something essential had already been Ahmed. She would share dinners, conversations, even brief romances, but never again the deepest part of herself. That had been given once, and it had nearly broken her. Behind closed doors, she wrestled with regret. Not for loving him, but for the cost of loving him in silence. For the family members she kept at a distance because she didn't know how to explain a life that looked so powerful from the outside and felt so lonely within. For the moments she chose pride over confession, control over comfort. As she aged, illness returned to her own body, slowing her speech, stealing her balance, forcing her to confront the very vulnerability she had spent a lifetime resisting. Near the end, those closest to her heard her speak differently, softer, more honestly. She admitted that strength had protected her, but it had also isolated her. That some of the greatest loves of her life were known only to her. That privacy, while sacred, had been both her sanctuary and her prison. And when she looked back at the woman the world called fearless, she saw someone brave, yes, but also someone who had loved deeply and paid for it quietly. The story of Katharine Hepburn does not live in awards or box office numbers. It lives in the relationships she guarded, the pain she carried without permission to share, and the truths she revealed only when there was no longer anything to lose. Beloved as she was by audiences, Katharine Hepburn spent much of her life believing that love, real love, was something you survived rather than celebrated. After the great loss that reshaped her inner world, she became more deliberate about what she revealed, and even more ruthless about what she concealed. Those closest to her sensed it immediately. There was a new stillness in her, a careful economy of emotion, as if every feeling now had to justify its existence before being allowed to surface. She kept working not because she needed the applause, but because the rhythm of production gave her somewhere to put the ache that followed her everywhere else. In private moments, she returned often to the ghosts of earlier connections. Lovers whose names were never printed beside hers, relationships that existed in half-light and implication. Some were intense but brief, fueled by admiration and proximity. Others stretched across years, sustained by letters and long phone calls that ended just before dawn. She was drawn to people who challenged her, who refused to bend to her will, who carried their own wounds with dignity. Yet every time intimacy threatened to become visible, she pulled back, fearing not scandal, but the loss of control over her own story. There were whispers, even among friends, about the true nature of some of these bonds. Hollywood legends whose lives intersected with hers in ways that felt too deep to be explained by friendship alone. Conversations that lingered too long, glances that held too much history. Katharine never confirmed any of it. She believed explanation diluted truth, and she preferred her truths unspoken. But in moments of exhaustion, when illness softened her defenses, she admitted that not being honest with the world had sometimes meant not being honest with herself. Her family felt this distance most acutely. Though she loved them fiercely, she struggled to bridge the gap between who she was at home and who she was everywhere else. Painful conversations were postponed indefinitely. Apologies were implied but rarely spoken. She carried guilt for missed birthdays, for phone calls not returned, for assuming that strength excused absence. When family members fell ill or passed away, she mourned deeply but privately, convinced that grief, like love, was something best handled alone. As the years went on, her own health began to betray her. Small signs at first, a stumble, a forgotten word. Moments on set where lines she'd known for decades suddenly slipped away. The woman who had built her identity on precision and control now faced the terrifying reality of decline. Doctors spoke carefully around her, but she understood. She had spent a lifetime reading between lines. Illness stripped away her remaining illusions, forcing her to confront what she had avoided: the need to be cared for, the need to be witnessed without performance. During this period, old friends returned, some with tenderness, others with unresolved resentment. There were emotional breakdowns behind closed doors, tears that shocked those who believed her incapable of such surrender. She spoke then, haltingly, about love that was never allowed to grow publicly, about choices she would not undo but wished she had faced more openly. She confessed that secrecy had been both her shield and her sorrow, and that the greatest tragedy was not losing love, but never fully claiming it. In the quiet of her later years, Katharine Hepburn began to loosen her grip on silence. Not completely, never entirely, but enough for fragments to escape. Enough for those paying close attention to realize that behind the legend was a woman who had loved fiercely, suffered quietly, and lived with consequences she never asked the world to understand. The camera had always adored her strength, but it was her hidden fragility that defined her most enduring relationships, shaping a life that was as heartbreaking as it was extraordinary. Respected though she remained, even as age slowed her steps and softened her voice, Katharine Hepburn carried the weight of unfinished emotional business like an invisible scar. In quieter moments, she admitted to a confidant that some relationships never really end. They simply change form and live inside you. She spoke of nights when memories returned uninvited, not as images, but as sensations, the warmth of a shoulder beside her, the sound of laughter drifting down a hallway, the heaviness of goodbye without ceremony. These were not memories she shared with the public. They were too raw, too intimate, too dangerous to release into a world that preferred its icons polished and uncomplicated. She often reflected on how Hollywood rewarded her defiance but punished her honesty. Being outspoken was acceptable. Being emotionally exposed was not. The industry applauded her refusal to be conventional, yet quietly expected her to follow unspoken rules about love, loyalty, and silence. When she defied those rules privately, she did so knowing that revelation would come at a cost she was unwilling to pay. There were contracts that depended on discretion, reputations that would not survive truth, and people she loved whose lives would be damaged by honesty. Protecting them became her justification, even when it meant carrying the burden alone. As the circle around her tightened with age, certain figures from her past resurfaced, sometimes physically, sometimes only in memory. Famous names whose presence once electrified her life, whose ambitions mirrored her own, whose flaws made them dangerously human. She recalled conversations with actors who were broken in ways the screen never revealed. Men and women who drank too much, loved too recklessly, feared irrelevance more than death. With them, she felt a kinship that went beyond romance, a shared understanding that greatness often demanded unbearable sacrifice. There were moments of regret she rarely allowed herself to dwell on, but when she did, they arrived with force. She questioned whether her relentless independence had sometimes crossed into emotional withholding, whether her refusal to explain herself had wounded those who wanted nothing more than to understand her. She thought about letters left unanswered, visits postponed until they were no longer possible, words she assumed were understood but were never spoken. These realizations did not make her bitter, but they did make her ache in a way she could not outrun. Her illness deepened these reflections. As her body weakened, her mind wandered more freely through the past. She spoke aloud to people who were no longer there, addressing them as if they might still hear her. Nurses and close friends overheard fragments of conversations that felt like confessions, apologies, declarations of love delivered decades too late. She never clarified who she was speaking to, and no one asked. There was an unspoken agreement that some truths deserved to remain suspended in mystery. In rare interviews toward the end, her tone shifted subtly. She spoke less about achievement and more about endurance, about how love, even when hidden, had sustained her through years of isolation and pressure. She acknowledged that some relationships shaped her more profoundly than any role she ever played, teaching her patience, humility, and the limits of control. Yet even then, she stopped short of naming names, choosing implication over exposure, honoring the privacy that had defined her life. Those closest to her sensed that Katharine Hepburn was preparing for something she had always resisted: surrender. Not to weakness, but to the reality that no one leaves this world without unfinished business. She grew quieter, more reflective, and in that quiet, the emotional architecture of her life became clearer. A structure built on passion, restraint, loyalty, and loss. A life shaped not just by what she did, but by what she chose to keep hidden. Beloved by generations who never truly knew her, Katharine Hepburn approached the later chapters of her life with a kind of calm that unsettled those around her. It wasn't peace exactly, it was acceptance layered over decades of emotional discipline. She no longer fought the memories when they surfaced. She let them sit with her, sometimes for hours, as if finally granting them the recognition they had been denied. In those moments, she no longer saw herself as the indestructible figure the world admired, but as a woman who had loved boldly and paid quietly. There were nights when old letters were taken out and reread, their edges worn soft from years of being handled and hidden away again. Some were passionate, others restrained, all of them incomplete in some essential way. She never kept them for nostalgia. She kept them because they proved something to herself. That what she felt had been real, that the sacrifices had not been imagined. She had lived in an era where certain truths were dangerous, and she had made choices that ensured survival, even when they required emotional exile. Fame, she realized, had distorted her relationships in subtle but devastating ways. People assumed proximity meant access, that admiration entitled them to intimacy. She became skilled at erecting boundaries that looked like aloofness, even cruelty, when in reality they were acts of self-preservation. Yet those same boundaries sometimes pushed away the people who mattered most, friends who needed reassurance, lovers who needed acknowledgement, family members who needed her presence more than her pride. She also spoke with unexpected softness about the people she hurt without intending to. Lovers she left without explanation, friends she kept at arm's length when they reached for more. Family members who never fully understood why she was present yet distant, loving yet unreachable. The realization that her silence had sometimes been interpreted as indifference haunted her more than criticism ever had. She admitted that being strong had been easier than being emotionally available, and that strength, when overused, could become a kind of cruelty. As death drew closer, the idea of last words began to weigh on her, though she treated it with her usual deflection. Still, in private moments, she practiced what she might say if given the chance. Not to the world, but to the people who mattered most. She wanted them to know that her reserve had never been a lack of feeling, that her distance had been born of fear and protection, not coldness, that every relationship she guarded had shaped her in ways no role ever could. The tragedy she carried was not that she loved secretly, but that secrecy became so habitual it followed her even when danger had passed. She wondered aloud whether she might have chosen differently in a more forgiving time, whether she might have allowed herself to be publicly vulnerable, publicly devoted. These thoughts did not bring bitterness. They brought a quiet sorrow, the kind that settles in the chest and stays there, asking nothing, offering no relief. Near the end, when conversation became exhausting and silence filled the room, Katharine Hepburn seemed almost lighter. As if releasing the need to explain had freed her at last. Those who sat with her sensed that she was replaying her life internally, not with judgment, but with a strange compassion for the woman she had been. A woman who had survived love by hiding it, and in doing so had both protected and wounded herself. The legend the world adored was fading, but what remained was something far more fragile and profound. A human being nearing the end, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of what she had carried alone for so long, beloved even in her silence. Katharine Hepburn entered the final stretch of her life with an awareness that felt almost cinematic, as if she understood she was approaching the last scene but refused to dramatize it. She disliked sentimentality, yet sentiment clung to her now whether she welcomed it or not. Those closest to her noticed how she would stare out windows for long stretches of time, her gaze fixed not on the world outside, but on something internal, something vast and unresolved. It was in those moments that her emotional life, so carefully guarded for decades, seemed to rise to the surface. She spoke less about love as passion and more about love as endurance. About the way certain people had altered the trajectory of her life without ever being publicly acknowledged. She admitted that some relationships had shaped her moral compass, her sense of loyalty, even her understanding of sacrifice. These were not affairs she dismissed as youthful mistakes or passing chapters. They were foundational experiences, carved into her identity. And yet, she accepted that history would never record them the way she experienced them. As her strength waned, the line between memory and confession blurred. She revisited moments of emotional collapse she had never allowed herself to process fully. The day she learned devastating news and went straight to set, performing flawlessly while her insides unraveled. The night she returned home to an empty house after a public triumph and realized there was no one she could safely call. The quiet breakdowns that happened far from cameras, where she allowed herself to cry only, until it threatened to undo her composure, then stopped. She acknowledged without self-pity that her life had been a series of calculated risks taken professionally but avoided personally. She wondered aloud whether courage had limits, whether she had reached hers too soon. Not in career, but in intimacy. The question lingered unanswered, heavy, but strangely peaceful. She was no longer searching for absolution. She simply wanted to see her life clearly, without the distortions of myth or expectation. In her final conversations, she returned again and again to the idea of truth. Not public truth, but personal truth. She said that some truths only exist to be lived, not explained, that naming them too loudly can diminish their power. It was her way of justifying the silence she left behind, though even she recognized that some silences had caused pain she could never fully repair. That recognition, more than anything, revealed how deeply she had cared all along. When the end finally came, it was quiet, almost understated, much like the way she had loved. There were no grand declarations, no final dramatic monologue. Just a presence, fading, leaving behind unanswered questions and emotional echoes. Those who knew her best felt that she had made peace, not because everything was resolved, but because she had finally stopped fighting the complexity of her own heart. Katharine Hepburn's private relationships did not weaken her legend. They complicated it. They revealed that behind the fierce independence was a woman who yearned, sacrificed, regretted, and endured. A woman who lived bravely in a world that allowed her brilliance, but demanded her silence. And in that silence, she forged a life as powerful and heartbreaking as any story Hollywood ever told. Legendary even in absence, Katharine Hepburn's story does not end with a final breath, but with a question that lingers long after the screen goes dark. Who was she? When no one was watching, when the strength fell away, and only feeling remained. The world remembers the voice, the posture, the defiance. But somewhere beyond the myth lives a woman who loved in fragments, who chose silence over spectacle, and who carried entire lives inside her that history will never fully name. Her private relationships were not footnotes to greatness. They were the cost of it. Each hidden bond shaped her more deeply than applause ever could, teaching her discipline, restraint, and the aching weight of unshared truth. She protected those loves fiercely, even when protection meant loneliness, even when it meant being misunderstood. She accepted that trade without complaint, believing that some connections were too sacred to expose, too fragile to survive the glare of the world. In the end, what remains is not scandal or revelation, but something far more haunting. A sense that the bravest thing Katharine Hepburn ever did was not standing alone, but loving at all in a time that gave her no safe way to do so openly. Her life reminds us that strength can coexist with sorrow, that independence can hide longing, and that the most powerful stories are often the ones left unfinished. She leaves behind no confessions neatly tied, no secrets fully unlocked. Only a quiet truth that echoes through her legacy. That even legends have hearts that break in private. That even the strongest souls carry regrets they never speak. and that sometimes the deepest love stories are not the ones we are told, but the ones we are trusted to feel between the lines.